Hello, and welcome to the Kongversation. I'm Hyle Russell.
And I'm Cameron Reigle.
And on this episode, we are discussing a book. Yes, we're discussing a book on a video game podcast. Of course, it ties in. We are discussing Sea of Thieves, Heart of Fire, the second Sea of Thieves novel, and by extension, second DKU novel by Chris Allcock. And just came out a couple weeks ago, and I just finished it 3 a.m. after 3 a.m. this morning. I finished the book, and I'm a slow reader, and I like to take everything in, and sometimes I get like hung up reading something that I'm really invested in, especially if it's official DKU fiction, obviously. But I just want to like make sure I absorb all the details and I have like a clear picture in mind of what's happening and trying to commit it to memory. So sometimes I will just get stuck in this horrible cycle where I'm reading and rereading the same passage again and again and again, and I can't break free from this obsessive compulsive need to like cement everything in my cerebral cortex. So yeah. Cameron, I think you breezed through this novel far quicker than I did.
Yeah, I had kind of this opposite experience. So I started reading the novel the day that I got it.
Mm-hmm.
And like, as in all things, I've learned I don't have any portion control because I told myself, well, I'm starting this now, but like, nobody is going to spoil this for me, and the people who I want to talk about it with are going to take a while to read it. So I'm going to take my time, maybe do like a couple chapters a day. So I like started reading it like at my job when there was like a slow period, and then like, and I made it maybe a quarter of the way through the book. And then there was a night I had like some trouble sleeping, and I'm not saying that I thought, oh, a Chris Allcock book that'll put me to sleep. No,
that's gonna be a pull quote that's gonna be a pull quote on his next book.
It was genuinely like I was not tired at all. Like my brain was too still running high. I needed to just use some mental energy to do something.
Yeah,
and so I started reading. I'm thinking like, well, I'll just read like a couple chapters and maybe my eyes will get tired.
Yeah.
My eyes did not get tired. I read the entire book that evening.
Yeah, so for me, like, I knew I had to get it done by today because we were set to record the episode about it today. Like, believe it or not, the Kongversation is running on a finely tuned schedule this year. And I've got like all these episodes planned out that we need to do to correspond to certain dates. And so it was time to discuss Heart of Fire. So I was like, all right, well, so long as I have it read by September 10th, which is the date we're recording this, then I will be fine. And life got very hectic very quickly. And all of a sudden I found that I didn't have much time to read it. And so by the time I got to yesterday, I still had about 150 pages to go. And so, which is almost insurmountable to me because as I said, my reading process when it comes to fiction that I really am invested in, especially if it ties into a larger shared narrative, as is, Rare Shared Universe, the DKU. And I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but what it amounted to was just deciding, okay, from 8 p.m. onward, I will read this, and I will read this until I am done, and only when I'm done will I go to bed. And I have been taking Sudafed just because of the late August, early to mid-September allergies that I suffer from. A lot of the grasses that grow this time of year, I'm apparently allergic to. And so I was basically like hopped up on pseudo reading this book until 3 a.m. I'm like, oh wow, it's like I'm on meth. Okay, this is really painting a glamorous picture of my life, but it really kept me focused, and I was able to overcome my weird mental hangups when it comes to reading novelized fiction, and yeah, I quite enjoyed it, but I feel like I've been hit by a weary ball from Captain Flameheart's forces right now, so apologies if I make any larger than normal malapropisms or just weird turns of phrase, or I just stumble over my own tongue. It's because I am exhausted. So what I do for this podcast and for this website, the bodily punishment I put myself through, I just hope you know, all of you know how dedicated I am to the cause.
And yeah, I was so engrossed that I read the entire thing a couple weeks back or so, and you have it a lot fresher in your mind. So, you know, we're starting off on a great foot
Right.
here to talk in detail about this book.
Well, before we try to talk in detail about it, I want to point out that we don't want to spoil the entire thing for our listeners, because the book is still relatively new. I mean, it is new. It's not even relatively new. It is still new. Some bookstores probably don't even have it on their shelves yet. And we're going to preserve some of the bigger twists and surprises, at least on this episode. You know, I don't want to say it's going to be completely spoiler-free, because that's not true, but we will not be divulging some of the bigger twists and realizations that come about in the book, of which there are actually several. So, not spoiler-free, but not spoiler-heavy either.
I would recommend, honestly, going into the book not knowing anything about it.
Yeah.
Because it's...
Yeah.
In fact, you know, just turn off this episode right now. You know, stop listening.
If you're on the fence about getting it, maybe listen to this episode, because we will maybe convince you one way or another to read it. But
yeah, I guess how I would say is, if you're a diehard Sea of Thieves fan and you're just chomping at the bit to get another Sea of Thieves story, then you might want to go in blind. But yeah, if you're on the fence, or you're curious about this, or you're not a Sea of Thieves regular, then yeah, we can maybe kind of convey why this is such a big deal.
yeah, exactly. I always view stuff like this, even if you're not interested in it, you might be interested in it as kind of a tourist fan. Like, obviously my fandom is concentrated in the Donkey Kong universe and the Shared Rare universe, but I also enjoy watching other fandoms and how they interact with their properties. So if you just want to do like this voyeur thing this episode and see how we engage with our second ever official expanded universe novel, then please keep listening. And there will be a follow-up episode coming very, very soon, where we will openly talk about some of the bigger WTF moments in Heart of Fire. And so we're not just saying like we're never going to get around to this. It's coming sooner than you think. But this episode is basically going to still be relatively safe if you don't want the experience ruined. All right, before we get started, I do want to give a quick plug to the DK Vine Twitch channel at twitch.tv/DK Vine. You can also find it at dkvine.com/Twitch. We stream roughly 2 to 3 times a week, depending on the week. It's generally Sundays. We stream the Sea of Thieves sessions we play every week, DK Vine Stream of Thieves. And in fact, I believe tomorrow, well, it's going to be yesterday when most of you are listening to this for the first time, but we're actually playing the tall tale that most readily ties in to this book. So, it's kind of weird how it all synced up. We were trying to replay the Tall Tales in advance of this novel, and then, the weekly grind of the game plus the new stuff that was being added, like the adventures, made us fall behind, but everything's kind of syncing up. So we're getting to the true connective tissue of the Tall Tales the same weekend we're recording this podcast. So
yeah, we there's two especially pertinent ones, and we've kind of made a sandwich of both of them
right.
with this episode.
Right. So I actually wouldn't change it. They kind of worked out perfectly as far as having the novel be more resonant and therefore making the Tall Tales more resonant with the experience of the novel. But yeah, we play Sea of Thieves practically every Sunday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. BST. So check that out. If you're on the fence about Sea of Thieves, if you're a Rare fan who still hasn't gotten into it, and you want to see how other Rare fans engage with it, and especially, like-minded weirdos like us at DK Vine, then it's definitely just worth, tuning in and checking out how we have our fun with the game, which is, I would venture to say, quite different from how the popular Sea of Thieves streamers have fun with the game. We're more Morningstar and less Prideful Dawn.
Also, way more references to 40-year-old bands.
Yes, yeah, and Grab by the Ghoulies. So we know what the kids want from Twitch. Check it out. But we also stream other DKU games, of course. I do DK Vine Done Slow, generally on Wednesdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 10:30 a.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. BST. Right now, I am finishing up Banjo-Kazooie, the original N64 version at that. And then I'll move on to another DKU game, and then another DKU game. And it's DK Vine Done Slow. I play the games very slowly, drawn out, focusing on the details. And yeah, it's like, oh, people like speedrunning? Well, let me do the opposite of that. I really know how to cultivate an audience. Then we have the Idaho crew. They stream Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. It's 1 a.m. Wednesday morning in the UK, so apologies there. But they stream a very eclectic mix of DKU games, and they will generally play a different game every week. Right now, they are in the middle of their Banjo-thon. They're playing all of the Banjo-Kazooie games chronologically, minus the mobile games. And they're not separating out the original N64 editions of Kazooie and Tooie from the XBLA editions, but whatever. They're playing most of them chronologically, sort of. So check it out. And, Cameron, and really the listeners at home, if you're like me and you've ever wanted to pan on a discarded drum in order to summon a megalodon that'll really get the party started, you'll be in need of an ancient temple deep underground. Not something that one has easy access to. But if you have a grocer that provides a fine selection of craft beers and a valid ID to prove that you're of drinking age, you can easily summon the next best thing to a party meg. A land shark! Yes, Jimmy Buffett's Land Shark Island-style lager is the taste that goes down smooth and cool, even if you've got the fiery rage of an Ashen Lord building inside of your bones. And why poison your rivals and your own crewmates with a spiked stew to get ahead in life, when you can all just chillax with a Land Shark and have a few laughs instead? Land Shark Island-style lager. If I'm plugging it, Jimmy Buffett must be paying me. And if I'm taking Jimmy Buffett's money, I must think it's good. Well, all right. Heart of Fire, Cameron. As I said, it is the second official Sea of Thieves novel. It's, to separate it out from all of the Sea of Thieves fan fiction out there. And by
the Sea of Thieves comics, or
right, yes.
I don't know, what would you call the Tales from the Sea of Thieves book? What is that?
I've described it as an in-universe ledger that you can hold in your hands. It's almost like a physical artifact from the Sea of Thieves made a reality and kind of pulled into your grubby mitts. But yes, this is a full-length novel, the second one in the DKU, because we are now in this era of the DKU where we're getting officially licensed expanded universe material rather than stuff like the Donkey Kong Country juvenile novels back in the day, which, you know, were licensed, but it was never done in the sense that, oh, this is going to be in canon. This is going to be done in concert with the developers of the games.
Yeah, I don't know if this is like still a novel concept considering the rest of the DKU up until this point, but this is like a very rare instance where we get tie-in media that will be reflected in the game itself.
Yeah. And there has already been a bigger back and forth between the expanded universe of Sea of Thieves and the game itself, where characters that debut first in the novels or the comics will eventually find their way into the game. References to events that happen in the EU pop up in the games. Like, everything is kind of made on an equal footing. They've got this grand master continuity map that they're all adhering to. And that's mostly the hard work of Chris Allcock, along with Adam Park, Pete Hentz, Mike Chapman, and others at Rare, who keep the tangled web of continuity of Sea of Thieves up and running. And it's made even more complicated when DK Vine comes in, because then we're like, but it also ties into the rest of the shared universe. So you've got to factor in 40 years of games, essentially. But
it's amazing that nothing has collapsed under its own weight yet.
Yeah. I mean, there have been some, I guess, minor hiccups here or there, but nothing that can't be hand waved away, which I don't have any examples, you know, at the forefront. But yeah, this like, is
the handful of times I think it has happened. It's been paved over so well that you don't really catch it.
Right. Just like any living shared universe, it's kind of this living thing, this organism that the stewards and creators who contribute to it, you know, they don't have full control over it. It just kind of has a mind of its own after a while. And so you kind of got to accept the hiccups along the way, but generally they're good at making sure those hiccups are properly stifled when they do erupt from the mouth hole. But yeah, this is a sequel of sorts to the first novel, Athena's Fortune, but it's got a mostly new cast and a different focus. I do want to point out really quick to all of you obsessive compulsive perverts out there like me who are bothered by this. Athena's Fortune was published by Insight Editions, while Heart of Fire is published by Titan Books. And as a result, the format of the book is different. Heart of Fire, I think, is the size of sort of a more traditional trade paperback these days, whereas Athena's Fortune was taller and wider. And so they will not sync up on your bookshelves, unfortunately. Think of it, if you really have a problem with it, think of it as when they changed up the Super Nintendo cartridges. Because, you know, originally the Super Nintendo cartridges were kind of plump and smooth on the bottom. And then, like, midway through the console's life, suddenly the cartridges were indented at the bottom. And they kind of had that slope. And, you know, so like the Donkey Kong Country trilogy was indented with a slope, but you compare that to something like Super Mario World or Mario Paint or something, and it's like, oh no, that's big and puffy at the bottom. Oh, what happened? And so, you know, you've got an incongruity in your game library, but we learned to live with it then, and we'll learn to live with it now.
Well, you know, Sea of Thieves just has to balance the space on your bookshelf, so, you know, it gets to have a galleon-sized book and a brigantine-sized book and A couple of sloop-sized books, maybe, in the future.
Yeah, and then you can have smaller books that you can attach to the back, like a rowboat. Titan has published nearly everything else in the Sea of Thieves EU, minus like the role-playing game. So it makes sense for the novels to be done by them as well.
Yeah, the books have been through a few different publishers. I think Dark Horse published the art book.
Right, I'm not including the art book because that's kind of an out-of-universe,
right,
behind-the-scenes look. But yeah, everything for the EU, comics, the Tales book, that was all done by Titan. So it makes sense that it's all under their umbrella now. But yeah, if it bothers you that Athena's Fortune has a different format, then you're just kind of have to whistle past that graveyard, unfortunately. But, you know, we can talk all day about the size of the book and the difference between trade paperback and the kind of different formats publishers are playing with to get a more comfortable handhold on their products. But first things first, Cameron, when we're actually discussing the meat and potatoes of the story, you know, I knew I was going to like the book, right? Like, that was never really a question for me. I was looking forward to this book almost as I was an actual game release, which, you know, says a lot about how much I thought of Athena's Fortune. Chris Allcock, the author, like, let's be upfront, he's always been a friend of the site. He's always been a grand ally of DK Vine. And so I loved Athena's Fortune even without that personal connection, that familial touch. I still really loved it. And part of that is because, you know, in many ways, Chris is like-minded. He gets what we're about, and he, you know, we're on the same wavelength most of the time. So it's not surprising that I would like his books. But, you know, I didn't have any expectations of adoring Heart of Fire as much as I did, or how definitely I did get into it and how much it resonated with me compared to Athena's Fortune. And I don't like doing this thing where it's like, oh, I like Heart of Fire so much more than Athena's Fortune because it sounds like I'm selling Athena's Fortune short. But yeah, Heart of Fire surpassed it, I think, in most respects that matter to me.
Yeah, it's certainly a very interesting thing to look back on, reading Athena's Fortune and reading this, because Athena's Fortune happened so early in the game's life. The landscape is just completely different.
Yes.
And I wondered, like, if that would, like, severely impact, like, my experience reading it, or the way it was written. I feel like things are definitely firing on all cylinders, with, like, perfectly in tune with the game itself in this. And it's, I don't know, like, I'm not saying, I don't want to draw a hard line, like, do I definitely prefer one book or the other, but yeah, I think Chris outdid himself here, and I loved Athena's Fortune.
Yeah, one thing that was immediately apparent to me, and this is going to sound like, because there's no way to really phrase this without making me sound like I'm ragging on Athena's Fortune, or that that's not my intent here. But one thing that was readily apparent to me when I started reading Heart of Fire was the confidence of Chris as a writer, as a novelist. It was just in abundant how efficiently he set up the twin cast, the two crews that are the focal point of this novel. He did it with such, like, again, like, efficiency and almost sleight of hand, where you knew everything you need to know about them by the end of their introductory chapters, and then you were off to the races. It was just amazing to me. And I think, as you said, one advantage was, of course, it is the second novel, and it was written well after the game was released, while Athena's Fortune had more of a parallel writing development with the development of Sea of Thieves.
I think that's even part of the, like, the more apparent confidence in this book, because I think Athena's fortune had kind of an unfair burden of needing to talk around things that may or may not have been in the game, because it was written as the game was in development.
Right.
Obviously, this was too, because the game is in ongoing development. But you can kind of take for granted, like, things that... Obviously, you want the book to be accessible to people who don't play Sea of Thieves, but you can also write the book knowing from a place that, okay, if I offhand mention this thing that is in the game, it's definitely going to be in the game in this form. Players will know what I'm talking about.
Yes, and as we, learned during our interview with Chris back in season 8, 2020, he wrote Athena's Fortune, while the game was still being formed. So he did have to kind of skirt around some things or be more vague. But also, he had to really set up the Sea of Thieves in and of itself. I mean, the Sea of Thieves was kind of a character in Athena's Fortune. Ramsey's crew and Lorena's crew, they both had to navel gaze, no pun intended, at the wonders of the world around them and really sell that to the reader. And here, that familiarity is kind of just assumed, and that really allows the focus to be more on the characters, and just, they quickly, I was going to say hit the ground running, but I guess they quickly set sail and make you care about the entirety of the cast and their adventures and their pursuits and desires. And there's less time being just, spent explaining things like the Devil's Shroud, or, how healing works in Sea of Thieves, or any of that. It's all just kind of assumed that the reader will know, either from Athena's Fortune or by virtue of playing the game for, upwards of 4 years or more. So, yeah, I think because of that, Chris had a greater command of what he needed to do and could do, and did it. I mean, and that's not to sell Athena's Fortune short, because Athena's Fortune was the novel it was supposed to be at the time it was released. But Heart of Fire, you couldn't do Heart of Fire as the first novel. But as a second novel, the differences between it and Athena's Fortune are apparent and appreciated.
Absolutely. And it is, of course, the second novel, and also the second novel to use this conceit of following the POV of two different crews, like, concurrently.
Yes, and it's done slightly differently than Athena's Fortune. Okay, so first of all, the story is ostensibly about the final days of Flameheart's original campaign of terror on the Sea of Thieves. And this is back when Captain Flameheart was a regular skeleton lord and not a flaming orange cloud in the sky. This is like the Flameheart of the cinematic trailers, of the statue at Rare, of the merchandise they released of him. It's the skeleton lord Flameheart, not the angry ghost man Flameheart. And as such, this takes place 8 years before the Seabound Soul Tall Tale. And that would, time is fluid in the Sea of Thieves, but we'll say that's roughly 9-some years before the events of the game begin, March 2018, our time. But the focus isn't really on Flameheart. It's more on the two crews who get swept up in the drama around Flameheart. The crew of the Morning Star, which consists of Captain Eli Slate, Dinger, the most hard-living 19-year-old there ever was, Fontaine, the pompous French philosopher, and newcomer Jill, the shipwright apprentice. And then we have the newly formed crew of the Prideful Dawn, and that is Captain Harry Harkley, Karen, which seems like an apropos name for somebody sailing in service of Flameheart. It's Karen with an I, not an E.
And a K.
And a K, yes. Jules and Scraps, no relation to longtime Kongversation listeners. Flameheart does appear although he's not physically present until the conclusion of the story, really. Whereas Athena's fortune jumped between two time periods of Ramsay's crew and, in the past, and Lorena's crew in the present of the book. These are both contemporary crews that are having voyages and adventures that relate to one another and take place concurrently. So it's different.
You're kind of watching like 2 points on a graph slowly converge.
Yeah. So there are some jumps in time here and there. Like the prologue takes place decades before the events of this book.
The prologue feels like it's dipping toes in for the people who are fresh off of Athena's fortune to kind of get them ground footing with familiar characters.
Yes. Without getting too much into it, the prologue takes place sort of in the middle of the time jump in Athena's fortune, after the parlay at Golden Sands Outpost. And we kind of pick up in the middle of those years. But Flameheart does appear in a brief interlude that's really the only dedication to his backstory that you'll find in the novel. And I know there are probably some Sea of Thieves lore hounds out there who are hoping the entire thing would be about Flameheart, like a villain origin story. But honestly, I don't think there's much story to tell.
And to be fair, like, Athena's fortune is, like, I think I can spoil Athena's fortune for people who haven't read it. It is a surprise villain origin story for the Gold Hoarder.
Yes. But I know, like, when this book was announced, there are a lot of, like, Sea of Thieves heads out there who were like, oh yeah, Flameheart book, we're finally going to get Flameheart's backstory, long live Flameheart. But like I said, I don't think there's really a meaty story to tell there, and I'm not just saying that because he's a skeleton. Flameheart's a bastard, and he became an even bigger bastard. The end.
Like, I don't want to get into it too much because, again, we're not trying to give away the game for people, but I could see some people being upset with the way Flameheart's backstory is handled here, but the reason that I love it is because it's not what people might expect.
Yeah, were this a product of a different era, like 2005 or so, then yeah, I could see Flameheart getting this big, almost sympathetic origin story that kind of like makes you look at him in a different light, like, oh, maybe he's an anti-hero, or oh, what a tragic backstory. Yeah, he's a villain, but it didn't have to be that way. And I enjoy that Flameheart is just an unrepentant shithead, because there are just some unrepentant shitheads out there, and we don't need to empathize with them or mythologize them.
This is like tuning into the Dateline special on Flameheart and finding, like, his neighbors talk about, yeah, he used to, like, burn squirrels in the yard.
But other than that, he seemed like such a nice guy. His ideology is toxic. And that's really what you need to know about Flameheart. But his followers are granted that sympathy that that maybe some people were hoping for Flameheart. We're even forced to see things from their point of view, however misguided that point of view may ultimately end up being. And so it's not like this is just a study of blacks and whites, like ultimate contrast, good versus evil. There's plenty of nuance in these characters, just like there is in Sea of Thieves itself.
Which I think is a more interesting premise for a story, which is not like, how did the scowly, ominous, yelling skeleton man turn out this way? It's, how did the ominous, burning skeleton man who yells threatening everybody actually sway people to his side?
Right, yeah, and that's what this novel really focuses on. And it really focuses on the divergent philosophies about being a pirate, what that means on the Sea of Thieves. Because, yeah, they're all pirates. That you have to keep that in mind. Like, the morality scale here, there's really no white hats. They're all criminals, but it's just a matter of, well, are you a criminal who stands for something, or are you a criminal who wants to just tear it all down? And so that's kind of interesting. Like, even somebody who is relatively virtuous, like Eli Slate, he's still a lawbreaker. He's still somebody who's thumbing his nose at what society dictates is acceptable. And so that's where the nuance, that's where the interesting character development really shines through. Not so much Flameheart. Flameheart is an instigator, and I think that's all he really needs to be. You can say, oh, he's a cool villain, I really love his design, but it's more about what this evil mastermind can do to other people that makes the story worth reading.
That said, if you're reading the story because you want to read about Flameheart doing cool shit, still read it. There is that in here.
Yeah, you can also see him sort of being a deadbeat dad. It's great. Without getting too much into it, did you have Harry Chapin's Cats in the Cradle playing in your head during the interlude?
No.
Oh,
no,
okay.
I did not.
All
but
right.
That is funny.
So, the crew of the Morning Star, they heavily factored into the tall tales in Sea of Thieves. Two of them, specifically, Fate of the Morning Star and Revenge of the Morning Star. And, amusingly, Revenge of the Morning Star was probably my least favorite tall tale. Of like all of the original, 9 tall tales.
And I know part of that is just mechanically, it kind of makes you do something a little bit frustrating.
Yes, yeah. It's funny how, Sea of Thieves can strike you depending on the mood you're in any given day, and how two people can walk away with completely different opinions on how content was executed. But for me, Revenge of the Morning Star, as you said, it was just a mechanically frustrating tall tale, but also because I just felt like the mythologizing of the Morning Star crew fell a bit flat with me, because they weren't really characters we knew all that well, and they were kind of built up and romanticized, and it was just like, we barely know these characters.
Like, those two tall tales are, like, the crew of the Morning Star is central to both of them, hence the name, but when I think of those two tall tales, of, like, if you were to ask me, like, who are the stars of them both, I would say, oh, it's the Ferryman and Greymarrow. Right. They're the standouts. And Slate and his crew are a means to an end within their story.
Yeah. So, they fell a bit flat with me at the time. But really, that makes them all the riper for an extended look at their exploits in novel form. And that allows them a chance to have layers and be fleshed out and make you care in a way that the game never could make you care about them. That's the advantage these novels and this tie-in expanded universe media has, is it can take these disparate characters from the game that you may not have thought much of and suddenly make you care a great deal about them, therefore making it all the richer when they do appear in Sea of Thieves.
Yeah, it completely reframed, because I think we replayed Fate of the Morning Star after I had finished the book, and it turned the experience from, oh, I'm meeting 4 new faces, to, oh, I'm seeing 4 old friends again.
Yeah. As far as the novels go, Eli Slate did briefly appear during the pivotal Parlay chapter at Golden Sands Outpost in Athena's Fortune. But this is our first real look at the inner workings of his ship and his crew. And his crew consists, at least at the start, of Eli Slate himself, 19-year-old Dinger, which, again, I keep harping on the 19-year-old fact because when we replayed...
Yeah, when we replayed The Tall Tale, there is an excerpt in the book identifying Slate's crew that says, marked under his name, 19 Summers, which we take from context to be his age, because a similar entry for Slate is in his 60s, which would fit for him. He's a He's like a graying up there man.
Yeah, so when I was first reading the book, I forgot about the smaller details of the Tall Tales. So I was picturing Dinger as like mid-30s at the earliest. I had this completely different vision in my head, and then we played the Tall Tale, and it's just like, wait, 19? Really? He doesn't even look like 19 because he's got the big like mutton chops, and
he's a very large man with a lot of facial hair.
Yeah.
Which in the book that you find in Sea of Thieves also doesn't help, because the very first picture you see of him is in black and white and makes him look like he has gray hair.
Right. So Dinger, of course, if you don't know, is actually a reference to Project Dream as Edson's dog. Or was it Edson's dog, or was it the dog of somebody else?
It's a dog. I don't remember if it's specifically Edson's or not. I feel like I want to say it was, but there's so much I don't know about Dream, or that I think I know about Dream, and it turns out I don't.
Right, and it doesn't help that Dream's development altered who the characters were over any given time. So Dinger was a dog in Project Dream, and he's the name was repurposed here. Now, that doesn't mean we won't eventually see a dog named Dinger, but whether or not he's named after this Dinger or Dinger is named after the dog, who knows? But and also it's just funny how the names in Project Dream I continually got wrong, because I always called Edson Edison, and I always called Dinger Digger, because you would think a dog would be somebody who would dig. But anyway, and then we've got Fontaine, who, as I mentioned, is a French philosopher with a sort of morose attitude about everything. And it was funny playing the Fate of the Morningstar Tall Tale while reading the book, because I feel like Dinger, and especially Fontaine, from the context of the Tall Tale after the book, they seemed flanderized in the Tall Tale. They seemed highly exaggerated funhouse mirrors of what's in the book. Like, just their more comedic traits, highly exaggerated.
Yeah, it's the difference between writing characters who you have to establish in the span of like one scene, who you may not ever see again, versus following them for an entire novel.
I likened it to in Doctor Who, when past doctors come back for multi-doctor stories. The past doctor is always kind of portrayed as a heightened version of themselves, with all of their tics like dialed up to the extreme to provide that contrast with the current doctor. And that's what it felt like they were doing with Dinger and Fontaine, even though that was their first appearance and the first time they were actually written for.
I remember distinctly, like, during the stream, we were reading Fontaine's dialogue, and I, like, because I knew people were watching the stream with us, I just, like, took an aside and said, like, I promise he's not this obnoxious in the novel.
No, Fontaine was quite enjoyable in the novel. But
I love him, and the recurring dynamic between him and Dinger, which is generally Fontaine will say something like using way bigger words than he has to, and Dinger will completely misinterpret what he said.
Yeah, it's the old slobs versus the snobs dynamic, Caddyshack. It's the oldest way to have contrast and a spicy relationship between two characters. So, it's appreciated.
They're great. I loved them in this book.
Yeah, and Eli Slate was a nice protagonist too, and he's interesting because he's a former military man who essentially broke bad and became a pirate, but he still has this code of ethics, this like sense of duty and responsibility to his crew, even making them dress up in matching uniforms.
He's I'd say he's like maybe the most like unambiguously like good guy on the Sea of Thieves that exists right now.
Yeah. I would say so, yeah. He's a little bit more rigid and uptight as compared to a Ramsey or
I'd say like traditionally like in the way that like you'd hold up like Superman in DC versus like the Flash or Batman.
Right. He's kind of like your stock character from like a Horatio Hornblower or Master and Commander or something like that.
Yeah. like honorable, clean-cut, stern guy.
Yeah, right.
But as we've said, like, it's shades of gray all over the place because it's the Sea of Thieves, and the way Slate does rub people the wrong way.
Of course. And however, the POV character really of the Morningstar chapters, and probably quietly the entire book at the end of it, is Jill, who is a shipwright apprentice who dreams of becoming a pirate and wants to sail on the Morningstar because it's such a fantastic galleon. And, interestingly, this puts the entire book sort of at a narrative disadvantage that Chris had to overcome, because we who played the Tall Tales know what becomes of Jill and the crew of the Morningstar in their titular Tall Tales, and we know their story has a less than happy ending, as far as anything can truly have an ending on the Sea of Thieves. And while Jill doesn't really have a villainous destiny, she's definitely set up to have a big fall, a big fall from grace, a shameful moral failing that ultimately she has to redeem herself from. And so, honestly, like, I made Breaking Bad joke, but it was a trip reading this directly after we finished watching Better Call Saul, because that was
Speaking of characters who debut being cartoon characters and then show up in depth in the long-term stories.
It's funny because I kept seeing parallels to Better Call Saul, because that's another prequel that had that problem to overcome, because here we have this quasi-sympathetic hero who we know ultimately becomes somebody who we don't want to root for. And like Better Call Saul, Heart of Fire has to overcome this by telling such a compelling story that you don't care about knowing what's the end of the story.
It's a hard thing to accomplish. Like, and I mean, I've said this before, like, I remember a time where I was frustrated with the announcement of Better Call Saul because they announced, Jonathan Banks won't be returning to Community because he's going to be in the prequel to Breaking Bad. I'm thinking, they're going to take a character out of my like favorite show on TV to tell this prequel story that doesn't need to exist so they can wring some more bucks out of Breaking Bad, and I was so wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, core to that point, like when you were talking about the moral ambiguity of the Sea of Thieves, like in my head, playing there was Mike Ehrmantraut's speech of like, it doesn't have to make, you did a thing that was against the law, that makes you a criminal. It doesn't have to make you a bad person,
right? But
it does make you a criminal.
Right, and that really is kind of the ethos of Sea of Thieves, and especially this conflict between people like Eli Slate and the crew of the Morningstar, who do represent something, and Flameheart and the crew of the Prideful Dawn, who represent something else, and where we see their interests actually intersect and where they may have this commonality of viewpoints is really interesting. Going back to Jill really quick, like I said, we know the end of her story, but that doesn't really factor into the book itself, aside from maybe a passing line or two. The Tall Tales are really almost serve as kind of a sequel to the novel in some respects, but I appreciated that Jill being a shipwright apprentice, which was set up in the Tall Tales as kind of a purely functionary part of the story, because they had to take this stock background NPC character and kind of expand on her a little bit to serve the function, be like, oh, actually, this character who's been here this whole time, guess what? But, you would think that having Jill as a shipwright would have just been this throwaway thing. But what Chris did was he took that and he made it a vitally important part of not just who she is, but also how the story would unfold, because it gave her this unique skill set, outlook, and knowledge base that aided the Morningstar, up to and including the unveiling of the MacGuffin of the book, which is a weapon of the ancients that is required, or they think is required, to fell Flameheart and his forces.
Yeah, I think it retroactively gives the reveal in that tall tale a lot more weight, really.
I mean, it gives the
Establishing
entirety
all
of
of
the tall
this.
tale more weight.
I mean, that's a recurring theme throughout this book, is just, I appreciate all of the in-game content with the Morningstar crew a lot more because of this book.
Absolutely. I mean,
It's a
like,
perfect complement to it.
you know, captaincy was recently added to the game, and we can finally sail on ships that we name and that belong to us, rather than just the system of loading into the game and you're provided with a ship that you can decorate with your own cosmetics, but it's not really yours. So
And a blank nameplate taunting you.
yes, for 4 years, but we do have captaincy in the game now. We have our own ships. DK Vine sails on a galleon named the Dreadfully Evil, named after our own Helmast. And, you know, when I was trying to break down what I wanted the Dreadfully Evil to look like, I also thought about what I wanted it to represent. And this is before I even read Heart of Fire, right? And I eventually like settled on the whole from the Morningstar, the kind of red and dark blue, almost black paint scheme that really made the Dreadfully Evil pop. But I also just thought, like, you know, what kind of pirates do I want us to be? And I even if I didn't really care that much about Eli Slate at that point, I did remember him from Athena's Fortune and the Parlay chapter. And I was like, yeah, that would be kind of fun to have the crew of the Dreadfully Evil honor the crew of the Morningstar who came before them with this paint scheme. And that's made even more resonant since finishing the novel after 3 a.m. this morning. So I'm glad I did that. And we also have so the crew of the Morningstar, they have a bear figurehead, right? And we on the Dreadfully Evil, we have a bear and bird figurehead that's patterned after a cave painting done by the ancients that basically prophesizes Banjo and Kazooie, the coming of Banjo Kazooie one day.
I remember Athena's Fortune hit so early that a lot of us like did think when it mentions in text, because obviously the novel's not illustrated, that Eli's ship has a big bear on the front of it.
Uh-huh.
A lot of us thought, oh, that's the Banjo figurehead. Come the tall tale in the game, it's definitely a different bear, but one that's like very stylistically similar.
Yeah, so I like that from our own character's perspective, we can continue the I guess lineage of the Morningstar, at least spiritually. But yeah, I mean, it really worked out well, and it like provided just this insight into who Jill was that, you know, maybe this kind of just throwaway thing from the Tall Tales designed to make you go like, oh, this NPC turned out to be something completely different than I thought. It actually is fleshed out in a very meaningful way. And that's what makes me so in awe of what Chris does here, because sometimes the best creative works come with strict parameters, right? When you have free reign to do anything you want, that freedom can be overwhelming, and you may not actually produce something to the best of your ability. But when you have to work within the strict confines of what's already been established, and, you know, we know this happens to the characters, and this is everything we know about their backstories and their past, and he's able to take that and make something really compelling out of it. And yeah, it's just crazy to think about the evolution of the novel coming after all of that stuff in the Tall Tales. Now, as I mentioned, there is a MacGuffin that the characters of the Morningstar are trying to uncover, because the narrative crux of the story is that Flameheart is making his final moves towards complete domination and ruin of the Sea of Thieves, because he wants to eliminate the cushy trappings that Ramsay the Pirate Lord helped establish with the trading companies. There's a big undercurrent behind a lot of the characters where they hate, more than anything, the Grand Maritime Union, which is sort of the stand-in for the East India Company in Sea of Thieves. it's it's just this big capitalistic, imperialistic, colonial, force on the seas. And a lot of people came to the Sea of Thieves to escape the tyranny of the Grand Maritime Union. The Grand Maritime Union has kind of been this grand, unseen, potential enemy in Sea of Thieves throughout, the 4.5 years the game has been out.
With, like, some hints here and there that they're, like, slowly digging their claws into it.
Yeah, like, the funny thing about Sea of Thieves, for those who don't know, is that it's continually juggling, like, 3 or 4 antagonists in the air at one time. So it's not just like, oh, Flameheart is the primary antagonist of Sea of Thieves right now. It's like, well, we've got Flameheart, we've got the Dark Brethren now, we've got the Grand Maritime Union, like, looming over everything. So there's always this sense of foreboding of, like, what's going to be the next shoe to drop. But anyway, like, the introduction of the trading companies like the Merchant Alliance and even, the Order of Souls or Gold Hoarders, that's really chafing a lot of the pirates because they feel what they went to the Sea of Thieves to escape from is now slowly encroaching upon this supposed Wild West of piracy.
Yeah, it's this, like, push and pull between, like, do you see the trading companies as this, like, bastion of, like, a way for people on the Sea of Thieves to support themselves, like, safely and, like, kind of support each other? Or do you see it as, like, this transparent introduction of, like, capitalists taking advantage of pirates and just telling you, no, we're the good ones?
Exactly. And so, Flameheart, what he represents to a lot of the pirates is tearing down that structure, that order that Ramsey is encouraging, and to make the Sea of Thieves a truly wild place once again. And, of course, Flameheart would rule as the new pirate king, but, if he's the means to an end, so be it. So Ramsey, the pirate lord, he enlists the crew of the Morningstar to help find this weapon of the ancients that is believed can be powerful enough to destroy Flameheart. And we're purposely left in the dark about what this weapon of the ancients is until its ultimate unveiling. But, Ramsey, pirate lord, he uses the research of an exiled Skelly from Flameheart's forces named Edmund. And Edmund becomes the unofficial 5th member of the Morningstar crew. And I have to say, Cameron, Edmund, from the outset, instantly became my favorite character of the novel.
100% agreed. And I think part of that is just the strength of the premise that, oh, one of the people we're going to follow is a talking friendly skeleton. I'm sold immediately.
There's just nothing funnier to me than an affable, friendly skeleton. And, I mean, that's why Mr. Ribs was such a delight in Grabbed by the Ghoulies and deserves to be held up in the pantheon of greatest rare characters, but never will be because the greater populace won't give Grabbed by the Ghoulies a chance, much to the chagrin of every time we reference Grabbed by the Ghoulies on our streams and then lose viewers. But Edmund was fantastic. I loved his introduction and reveal, which played with the cadence of a Goosebumps novel chapter break. I don't know how much R.L. Stine you read in elementary school, Cameron, but
not very much, because I was a weenie who expected them to be a lot scarier than they actually were.
Yeah, so what Goosebumps would do they would generally end chapters with this big, supposedly horrifying reveal, and then you turn the page and it just turns out the character was being a weenie and just imagining things. So it would be like, and then the character entered the classroom and was immediately greeted by a skeleton. And then you turn the page and you find out it was the skeleton in their science class, like the model skeleton. Yeah. So it just played with that kind of like cheeky R.L. Stine level of like, "Oh, we hooked you, but you can't stop reading," which made me laugh out hard.
It's also the strength of telling this story in the form of a novel, because like I can imagine this as silly as I want to.
Yes.
Whereas like if you tried to do it in any other medium, you'd probably have to like ratchet down how goofy this sounds.
Yeah, I know.
But I love it so much. Edmund is great.
Like when I said Chris is on our wavelength, this is exactly what I mean, because this is like catnip to anybody who's been around DK Vine enough years that this of course would be our favorite character. And yeah, so as soon as Edmund was introduced, I think that's really what I was like, all right, I love this book. Like I was worried something was going to happen to Edmund. Like I was worried he was going to betray the crew or be like some sort of like Trojan horse, or he would just like go away. But Edmund turned out to be a fairly sizable character in the end of it. And
yeah, he only gets cooler as the book goes on. I would say like it didn't really stop. I didn't really stop from the height of like being excited when he showed up.
I imagine we will have far more to discuss on Edmund in an upcoming episode.
I think Edmund is specifically why I didn't put the book down that evening. I just, like, I want to know what happens with Edmund.
Right. Whenever the book would roll back around to a Morningstar chapter, I'd be like, all right, let's check in with Edmund. Not to the disservice of any of the other characters, but he was the breakout star by far. He was the Urkel or the Fonz of Heart of Fire. Like, I want now like an Edmund like, spinoff.
Charlie Brown's great, but I want to see Snoopy on his doghouse fighting the Red Baron.
Yeah. So, maybe just a full-on Edmund spinoff game, like a prequel or something, would suit me just fine. But there's also a sixth member of the Morningstar crew. We mustn't forget. A snake that's left behind from a merchant voyage near the beginning of the novel. A snake that they name Chomps. So, I have to imagine the name was an intentional nod to the Donkey Kong Country enemy. So the question is, was Chomps named by the crew of the Morningstar after the sharks that are known to patrol the waters of Crocodile Isle and DK Island, as the carnivorous plants seen in the retro games were named after the sharks, or what?
Is Chomps just like to non-human like creatures in the Donkey Kong universe what the name like John or Michael is?
This is the John Smith of taxidermy. Yeah, I don't know. I thought that Chomps would have just been like a one-off joke, but Chomps actually becomes like the mascot of the ship, or like their animal buddy in kind of a weird way. And again, when I say the author is on our wavelength, I was often worried about Chomps. I was like, nothing's going to happen to Chomps, right? Nothing's going to happen to Chomps. And it's almost like he knew we would have that concern, and he was like, don't worry. I'm taking good care of Chomps. You don't have this isn't a story where the dog dies. Don't worry. It's not going to go down that route.
No, we can't have a Newberry medal covering Flameheart's beautiful face on this cover. By the way, just got to say, this cover art for this book by Thomas Mahone, fucking fantastic. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, I would find myself, when I was picking up the book to read or putting it down for the night, or finally putting it down after 3 a.m. this morning, I would just stare at the little images of the Morningstar facing off against the burning blade. And I just love the little detail that you can make out the silhouette of the bear figurehead on the front. And, obviously like the focus was on Flameheart's skull on the horizon, but just everything about it is absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. It's a very striking image, and it's also very timely. I feel like this would be a book that people will pass during the Halloween season, and with just the orange font and just the dark hues. It just seems like it's a very seasonally appropriate or upcoming seasonally appropriate novel to check out.
If memory serves, I think it might have been you. Didn't you share a picture of Sea of Thieves like hanging out in a bookstore with like a bunch of other pirate fiction and just really standing out with this cover?
Yeah. I wandered into a bookstore the week this book came out, and because I was just like trying to buy several copies for various reasons. I like to, have giveaway prizes for DK buying on social media, and also I was just looking for additional copies for myself because the copy I read is not the copy that goes on my bookshelf because I have to keep it pristine. And unfortunately, reading this book, you will kind of crack the spine a little bit. But, so I was just looking, like, there's a big problem of, this cover is kind of slightly scuffed up. This one's got a little bend in the cover. So I was just on the hunt, and I strolled in, and sure enough, the book was on a table of like pirate fiction. Along with Athena's Fortune and some YA fantasy stuff.
Yeah, not video game books, which is really, really neat to see.
Yeah. So, anyway, as we mentioned, the novel does intercut chapter by chapter with another crew, but taking place concurrently with the events of the Morning Star, and finally allowing the crews and their fates to converge. And the other crew, as we mentioned, is the Prideful Dawn. And that is a galleon that's kind of been commandeered by a band of outcasts looking to seek an alliance with Flameheart in order to reclaim what their idea of true freedom on the Sea of Thieves really is. And look, I was hesitant at first to spend any time with a bunch of assholes. Because as I initially saw them, because, times be tough, Cameron, and I'm so fatigued, and I've had to stop like doom scrolling the news, and I don't want to be reminded of assholes. I don't need to be reminded.
I don't need to hear the justification why a bad person did a bad thing. They did the bad thing, and that's all I need to know.
Yeah, I'm too tired for that right now. So, like I said, I was a little bit weary when, we left the Morning Star and came to the crew of the Prideful Dawn for the first time. But the great narrative weight that Chris Allcock had on his shoulders, trying to make them likable, was definitely lifted up over his head. And by the end of the novel, I think I was just as captivated by the Prideful Dawn's exploits as I was the Morning Star, which I did not anticipate.
It really helped me, like them and like following their story, that the crew of the Prideful Dawn are all like kind of separated by like varying degrees to which they've drinking the Flameheart Kool-Aid.
Yes. And
like ranging from all in to entirely a victim of circumstance.
Yeah, and as great as it was to not have Flameheart be sympathetic in any way, I think it was needed to be part of what made the Prideful Dawn's crew work from a reader's perspective. The old adage that hurt people, I think can be readily applied to all four of these characters to some degree, because we get glimpses and little clues to their troubled childhoods and various reasons as to why they would take up the flag of a genocidal madman like Flameheart. Like you said, varying degrees of being all in, because some of the characters quickly have doubts about how far things are escalating, and to have that contrast and have that friction in the crew really made it a compelling read, especially like the way they would root and ground the characters in situations and also with characters that you may know from the game. And I thought it was expertly handled. And one of the more effective and chilling sequences in the book are the dreams that the captain, Harry Harkley, has about the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father when he was a child. And I think that's maybe the darkest path we've ever gone down in any Rare production, because it's, it's not sugar-coated. It's not like traumatic. Like it's not like you're gonna get like pages and pages of child abuse, but it's just done in a very chilling, surprising way that makes it dreamlike and kind of exaggerated, but you still feel the weight of what happened to him.
It's uncomfortable, but it's not reveling in it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And yeah, so like, Harry Harkley, he is the captain of the Prideful Dawn, or becomes the captain of the Prideful Dawn when they steal the Prideful Dawn, from the outposts that they're on. And he is the one who quickly, becomes the most dedicated advocate of Captain Flameheart for varying reasons, as will become apparent as the book unfolds. And so he's probably the closest one who you lose sympathy with, but I think keeping in mind that we do get the glimpses of his childhood from his perspective, we understand how he was led down that path, and we can feel sorry for him, even if ultimately, you know, we are not meant to agree with him. But the crew members of Harkley are, I think, far more sympathetic, and that is Karen, Jules, and Scraps. And yeah, I was surprised at how quickly I gravitated to these three. And as you said, their little reactions, the little interplay they have with each other and their captain really helps make them understandable and relatable in a way that I wouldn't have believed possible.
And I think with the exception of Harkley, like none of them feel like bad people when you're reading them.
Yeah, they're doing bad things, and they've gone down a bad path, but they're not irredeemable.
Jules in particular, I think, was the most sympathetic because she is literally only there out of like bad luck.
Yes.
Like she wasn't even like she's not in it for investment with Flameheart. She's in it because she just happened to be like near these other three when people were angry with them like talking up Flameheart.
She's completely a victim of circumstance, and that becomes a repeating element of her character, where she's kind of just along for the ride, and she quickly realizes like, oh my god, I'm in over my head, aren't I? But she does strike up a camaraderie with Karen and Scraps. Scraps is the named as such because he is the cook on the ship, and he just, you know, he makes a mean stew.
And Scraps like doesn't seem so like, again, we talked about like varying degrees. He doesn't seem so much like he is like all in on getting in Flameheart's good book so much as he just is one of the many pirates on the Sea of Thieves who doesn't care for the trading companies.
Right, and we understand, we're made to understand why he would have an issue, a philosophical issue with any trading company, even if the primary source of his pain is the Grand Maritime Union.
And like, not entirely wrong, we know one of them is run by the Gold Hoarder in like a shadow operation.
Right, yeah. Karen, I was surprised because I was initially made or initially assumed that I would dislike her as much as I would dislike Harkley. She goes through the ringer though, and she comes out on the other end. I think
I definitely feel like you're set up to like think poorly of Karen when she shows up, and like kind of soften once you like observe the depth of her character a little bit more.
Exactly. There is a pivotal moment that the crew experiences together where you realize the depths of Harkley's devotion, and it's a realization for Karen as well, where he may prioritize getting in good with Flameheart over the well-being of his own crew. And that's kind of this sobering wake-up call for her, and by extension, the other two. What I didn't expect from Heart of Fire when I set out to read it was how damn resonant it was going to feel given what's been happening in the world. Oh, I don't know, the past decade or so. You know, with the rise of authoritarianism, and, you know, there are many out there who feel like the only solution to these severe problems plaguing civilization is to hand the keys over to madmen and watch the entire thing burn down. And so I don't know if the parallels there were intentional or if it's just inescapable scene parallels in the fiction and media we consume during these times, or if it's subconsciously played out in the author's mind. But it really hit me as the story of the Prideful Dawn progressed, how we could be seeing the story of like our own relatives we don't really talk to anymore, or everybody has people in their lives that they've kind of distanced themselves from, and why they were led down that road differs. But it really hit me when we got to the climactic final battle and seeing all the disparate and sometimes oppositional forces of the Pirate Lord and the trading companies all allying in order to fend off Flameheart's tyranny, and just seeing like all these just like people from all walks of life say, no, we're done with this. We're not going to let them destroy everything just out of pettiness and spite. It really made me like, I actually like pumped my fist in the air a little bit. You know, Rise of Skywalker, that Star Wars movie that people don't seem to like that much. I feel like what they were trying to pull off in the final bits of Rise of Skywalker, the message they were trying to convey with like the galaxy finally standing up to Palpatine and being like, nah, we're done with this. But it was kind of completely like flaccid because they spent no time like establishing how Lando reached out to everybody, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like Chris pulled it off. He pulled off what Rise of Skywalker couldn't, because I pumped my fist in the air and I was like, yeah, when everybody showed up, and it made me feel good about like the battles in reality, like what we have to achieve as a civilization, as a species, as a worldwide community to fend off the forces of darkness. And I was just like, wow, it was the opposite of doom scrolling the news, reading this at 3 a.m. And I was like, wow, I feel good. And it really like pumped me up to like want to like go out there and volunteer and like, I don't know, but it also made me want to play Sea of Thieves a little bit more too. So
it's a very, I'd say it's a very cathartic feeling read to just, see this story play out in the way it does. And even like on a like a lighter note, it's also interesting to get this type of story being told fresh off of an in-game event in Sea of Thieves, where we literally had like the forces of, do you want to do the right thing or do you want to do the bad thing because it's interesting?
Yeah. And the forces of the right thing actually won out. So it definitely made me like...
It would have given this book such a weird layer if things came out the opposite way in that in-game event. There's no way to coordinate that, but...
I was thinking that too. And I was thinking like what the message this book is conveying, like it would have been completely undercut by the community had Golden Sands Outpost like actually fallen. And there is like a line or two set up in this novel that hints towards that adventure where Flameheart says, maybe one day he'll wipe out Golden Sands. And I was like, I wonder if that was an intentional nod or if that's just a complete coincidence given the way. We'll have to ask Chris at some point. But yeah, I mean, I didn't expect it to be such like a feel good, like triumphant thing. Like, because you're setting out to read something like Sea of Thieves, Heart of Fire, and Chris is a hell of a writer. He really is. But I'm not going to like pretend like this is like up there with the works of Charles Dickens, because it is tie-in genre fiction for a video game. It can never be its own thing precisely because it does have to play in concert with everything else that came before it, including Chris's previous novel. And so I was expecting a really well-told yarn about the Sea of Thieves, about characters that we briefly met in Sea of Thieves, and would maybe, provide this nice little prequel that I could then mentally insert into my understanding of the world. I didn't expect it to be so life affirming. Which is weird. And that was the best surprise coming out of it, was just how timely it felt given everything, you know?
Yeah. Though, also, classic literature doesn't have enough talking skeletons.
It does. It really doesn't. And I was just thinking, you know, what if Hemingway had just thrown in a talking skeleton in some of his works? What if The Old Man in the Sea was about a skeleton in the sea? Would kids, I don't know, take to classic literature far more? Would, you know, we be a more enlightened, articulate, literate society? I think the answer is yes, because who doesn't love a talking skeleton? So I don't know, Cameron. Like, honestly, I don't know. Because it's hard for me to know, because I'm so deep into Sea of Thieves. I'm so deep into Rare. I'm so deep into the DKU. I don't know if I could recommend Heart of Fire to our listeners who haven't played Sea of Thieves, because I honestly can't divorce myself from how it would read if they haven't. I think Athena's Fortune worked rather well as an introduction to the Sea of Thieves, to this corner of the world. And Heart of Fire certainly could work as a standalone experience, but I think it would be far more impactful if you have some baseline understanding of the game, because some of those big needle drop moments I don't think would really make sense to you unless you knew what it was referencing, what character you were encountering. But if you have played Sea of Thieves, then yeah, absolutely. You definitely need to pick this novel up today. Go out to the bookstore, order it online. It would, in my opinion, only increase your passion for the game, which I think is the best thing that can come out of this expanded universe literature. I already mentioned Star Wars, and I mentioned Star Wars when we talked about Athena's Fortune, because Star Wars is my go-to example for an EU that I think increases your investment in the more mainstream elements of that franchise, like the movies or the TV shows. Like, if it wasn't for Star Wars literature, would Star Wars have gotten as big as it did in the 90s, even before the special editions and the prequels? I don't think so. And, you know, I look back at my own, like, fandom of Star Wars, which has ebbed and flowed, you know, as I think most people's have over the years. But it was Shadows of the Empire that really made me a Star Wars fan, because all of a sudden I had this kind of like secret story that not everybody knew about. I was like, oh, I know what happens between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I know who Dash Rendar is. Ooh, this is cool. I have such a richer understanding of the movies now, which is bullshit because it's not even canon anymore, but you know what I mean. And the great thing about the Sea of Thieves EU is I know how dedicated Rare is to it, and I know it won't be decanonized. They're not going to just chuck it out.
The worst thing that you can do with like an expanded universe material like this is put out something that doesn't feel like it matters.
Exactly.
This feels like it matters.
And I don't think it's essential to enjoying the game, but it will make you love the game even more. And I think that is the fine line to walk when producing something like this. So, I don't know. I'm excited to play Sea of Thieves tomorrow, Cameron, because it really did make me look at my own pirate character, Cousin Russell, in a new light. Because it you know, I've always thought about what my pirate character represents and how he interacts with the world of Sea of Thieves. But I really hope this novel makes you at home ask what your pirate character, he or she or they, represents and stand for in the context of this grand shared universe. I think it will. I think reading this, you can't help but think, like, where do I stand in this story? And that's the great thing about Sea of Thieves, is it does feel like your pirate character can influence the evolving world around them. And that's even much appreciated to Chris. There is a historian's note at the beginning of the novel. And it starts off by saying, this story takes place roughly 8 years before the events of the Seabound Soul, the fateful day that saw Sir Arthur Pendragon and a pirate crew inadvertently revive the notorious skeleton lord Flameheart. And for those who don't know, that ambiguity there of Sir Arthur Pendragon and a pirate crew is intentional because it's designed to allow you to mentally insert your own pirate crew into that tall tale. To each and every person who played that tall tale, you are the one who is referenced in that historian's note. And that's a little touch that I love, that, he didn't just come in and say, okay, well, I know everybody has their own personal canon, but I'm going to say it was Sir Arthur Pendragon and this crew. The end. You can't complain about it. It's canon now. Didn't do that. He didn't overwrite it. And that's much appreciated, because it does make you feel like your personal experiences in the game matter. So, yeah, it definitely really makes me Jones to want to play Sea of Thieves, and we get to play Revenge of the Morningstar tomorrow. That's just fortuitous timing. I don't know. So before we go, Cameron, there are some references I would like to point out that I feel like would be appreciated by the DK Vine Kongversation audience. So,
do tell.
All right. As we mentioned, there is a snake named Chomps, and you might be thinking, why didn't he name the snake Slippa? Well, okay, but it's named Chomps, all right? And he's a delightful snake. You're going to love him. There's a sequence where the Morningstar crew battles skellies on a fort, and Jill picks up a barrel. Oh, yeah, she picks up a barrel. And what does she do with the barrel? Well, she rolls it down a flight of stairs, Donkey Kong arcade style, knocking out the skellies below. Now, if Chris wasn't thinking of Donkey Kong during this sequence, well, then he's a liar, because of course he was thinking about Donkey Kong during this sequence. So there you go. For you Donkey Kong arcade fans out there, hello to Gibbon in the live stream. Hello to Trey as well. An undercurrent of this story ties into the tall tales, as we mentioned, and an ability that some skeleton lords have to bind souls to objects, preventing them from moving on to the afterlife and resurrecting on the Ferry of the Damned. This is ultimately the fate of the Morningstar, after all. Well, early on, the crew of the Prideful Dawn meets a unassuming, kindly, old fisherman by the name of Tom Toggs. Tom Toggs. Now, Tom is ultimately locked inside of his own sloop's brig as Harkley sets the ship on fire. We never see Tom Toggs' demise, but it got me thinking, what if Tom Toggs never makes it to the Ferry of the Damned? What if some Skelly Lord, I don't know, intervenes as Tom Toggs is left to burn, and Tom Toggs' soul is bound to an inanimate object, as we see happen to other characters throughout this story? Something simple, perhaps, his soul could be bound to. I don't know. Perhaps a tool or timekeeping device of some sort. What if Tom Toggs' soul was put into a stopwatch?
No.
I will ask Chris Allcock this to his face when we have him on the show for our annual Talk Like a Pirate Day episode. That's right. Hashtag Tom Toggs is TT in Sea of Thieves.
This has been a File 2 production. Que rico.